The old folks in Cypress Creek Hollow say the land remembers. They say it has a pulse, slow and deep like the bayou water, and that it keeps a ledger of all the joy and sorrow that seeps into its soil. I used to think that was just poetic nonsense, the kind of folksy wisdom whispered on front porches to make the world feel less random. I was a woman of logic, of cause and effect. But logic is a fragile thing in a place like this. It's a flickering candle in a hurricane of belief, and my belief, my carefully constructed world of reason, was about to be extinguished. My story, or rather, our story, began with a wedding. Mine. It was early September, 2009. The air in the hollow was thick and sweet with the smell of late-blooming magnolia and roasting pig. The Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks swayed in the humid breeze like the gray beards of sleeping giants. Fiddle music, fast and joyous, spilled out from the open doors of the community hall. It was a perfect day, a day of bright, uncomplicated happiness. But even then, amidst the laughter and the dancing, I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor of unease. I saw it in the eyes of the old women as they watched me, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. I heard it in the low, hushed tones of the old men as they huddled together, their gazes lingering on my father. They were whispers of a covenant, an unspoken rule of the hollow that my family was about to break. A month later, my younger sister Rosalie announced she was getting married. She was a whirlwind of impulse and passion, a stark contrast to my own cautious nature. Her fiancé, Daniel, was her mirror image, a man whose heart was as big and open as the Louisiana sky. They were both born in the year of the tiger, a fact the old folks clucked their tongues at, seeing it as a sign of a volatile, fated pairing. Daniel had just gotten a big promotion at the sugar mill, and they didn't want to wait. They wanted to seize their happiness, to drink it down in one greedy gulp. They set a date for December. The whispers in the hollow grew louder. 2 daughters in 1 year, I heard old Mrs. Thibodeau mutter to my aunt. That's a double harvest. The land won't like it. It throws off the balance. I had rolled my eyes. Balance. Harvest. It all sounded like something out of a half-forgotten ghost story. My father, a man more concerned with the price of crawfish than the moods of the land, had dismissed it as old wives' tales. And so, we celebrated. We danced at Rosalie's wedding, a smaller, more hurried affair than mine, and we toasted to their future, blissfully, stupidly unaware that we had just signed a pact with a power we did not understand. We had taken too much joy from the hollow in too short a time, and the hollow, in its own slow, deliberate way, was about to demand a payment. 2 years passed, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rosalie and Daniel were deliriously happy, their love a bright, burning thing that seemed to defy all the superstitious mutterings. I was content in my own quiet way. The unease of the weddings had faded into a distant memory. Then, in the spring of 2011, I lost a small, sentimental piece of jewelry, a locket my grandmother had given me. It was a trivial thing, but it gnawed at me. Rosalie, ever the believer in the unseen, suggested we go see Thay Elzier. Thay Elzier was a local legend, a hoodoo root worker who lived deep in the Cypress swamp. He wasn't a charlatan or a showman. He was a quiet, wizened old man who people said could see the threads of fate that connected all things. He didn't take money. You brought him offerings, a bottle of good bourbon, a pouch of tobacco, a live chicken. Daniel, who found the whole thing amusing, tagged along with me carrying a bottle of whiskey as our offering. Elzier's cabin was a thing of myth, a small, crooked shack on stilts, surrounded by the dark, still water of the bayou. The air inside was thick with the smell of dried herbs, beeswax, and something else, something ancient and earthy. Jars filled with murky liquids and strange roots lined the shelves. Dried alligator feet and bundles of feathers hung from the rafters. It was a place that felt suspended between worlds. Elzier listened to my story about the locket with a patient, knowing look. He performed a small, simple ritual with a bowl of water and some herbs, and told me I would find my locket in a place of childhood memory within 3 days. He was right. I found it in an old music box I hadn't opened in years, but before we left, his gaze settled on Daniel. The playful curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a deep, profound sadness. "You," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You and your wife, you burn so bright. Too bright for this place." He looked out his small, dirty window towards the dark swamp. The hollow likes balance. You can't take 2 harvests from the same field without letting the ground rest. You've made the land hungry. He turned back to Daniel, his eyes dark pools of prophecy. Be careful in June, he warned. There will be a great loss. The hollow will come to collect. It will take back what it believes it is owed. We left the cabin in a stunned silence. Daniel tried to laugh it off, calling Elziar a spooky old coot, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. His words had felt less like a prediction and more like a pronouncement, a sentence that had already been passed. June arrived with its oppressive, suffocating heat. On the 12th day of the lunar month, the news came. Daniel's paternal grandmother had passed away in her sleep. She was old, her health had been failing. It was a sad but not unexpected death. Everyone called it a coincidence, but I knew this was the great loss Elziar had spoken of. I felt a surge of relief, a foolish, selfish hope that the debt had been paid, that the prophecy had been fulfilled. At the funeral, a local preacher, a man who dabbled in the old ways, conducted the service. He warned that those born under a bad sign, those with a volatile spirit, should not approach the open casket. It was an old superstition meant to keep restless spirits from being drawn to the newly deceased. He was looking at Daniel, but Daniel, his face a mask of grief, ignored the warning. He stood by his grandmother's coffin for a long time, his hand resting on the cold wood. As he stood there, I saw it, or I thought I saw it. A flicker in the air behind him, a ripple like heat haze that coalesced for a split second into a tall, dark shape before dissolving back into nothing. I blinked, my heart pounding. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. The heat, the grief, it was nothing. 2 weeks after the funeral, a sliver of joy broke through the gloom. Rosalie, her face glowing, told me she was pregnant. The news was a bomb, a promise of new life after a season of death. That night, Daniel went out with a few friends from the sugar mill to celebrate. He was ecstatic, on top of the world. He kissed Rosalie goodbye, promising to be home early. He never came home. I was staying with Rosalie that night, trying to keep her company. We were sitting on her front porch, listening to the chorus of frogs and cicadas, when she suddenly gasped. Her face went pale. "What is it?" I asked. She was staring out into the darkness, her eyes wide with terror. "I just had the strangest, most awful feeling," she whispered, "like a waking dream. I saw a face in the window. It was all bloody and swollen." She started to cry, her body trembling. I held her, trying to soothe her, telling her it was just her pregnancy hormones, the stress of the past few weeks. The knock on the door came at 2 in the morning. 2 sheriff's deputies, their faces grim in the yellow porch light. There had been an accident, a single-car crash on a dark stretch of road a few miles away. Daniel, he was gone. The hours that followed were a blur of numb, mechanical movements. The drive to the county morgue, the cold, sterile smell of antiseptic. The moment the coroner pulled back the white sheet. I tried to shield Rosalie, to stop her from looking, but she pushed past me. She needed to see. And then she let out a sound that was not human, a raw, animal cry of pure agony. The face on the metal slab was a mangled, unrecognizable mask of blood and bruised flesh. It was the face from her dream. The accident made no sense. Daniel was a good driver. The road was straight. The weather was clear. The official report said he had simply lost control and hit a cypress tree. But the other driver, the one who had been the first on the scene, told a different story. He was a distant cousin of ours, a man named Beau. He was driving home from a late shift when he saw Daniel's truck swerve violently, as if he were trying to avoid something in the road. Beau swore there was nothing there. He said it was like Daniel had been yanked off the road by an invisible hand. A week after the funeral, a strange woman appeared at my parents' house where Rosalie was now staying. She was an old woman, her skin as wrinkled and dark as a walnut. It was Bala Blanc, a woman who lived alone in the swamp and was rumored to be a mambo, a voodoo priestess. She asked to speak to Daniel's mother. I stood in the doorway listening, my blood running cold. "The boy was a good soul," Bala Blanc said, her voice a low, raspy croak. "But his time was up. The hollow took him. It needed to restore the balance." She looked at Rosalie, who was sitting silently on the couch, a hollowed-out shell of her former self. "The baby," the old woman said. "It will be a boy. He will have his father's face, and his father's spirit will not be far. He will come home to visit. In 21 days, he will be here." We tried to dismiss it as the ramblings of a crazy old woman. But on the 21st day after Daniel's death, the third Sunday, a day the old folks called the Third Seven, it happened. Both Rosalie and Daniel's mother woke up screaming. They had had the exact same dream. Daniel had been standing in their rooms wearing the same blue work shirt he had been wearing the night he died. He hadn't spoken. He had just smiled, a sad, heartbreakingly familiar smile, before fading away. After that, his presence lingered. I would stay with Rosalie, sleeping on a cot in her room, and at night I would hear it. The faint, familiar sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the jingle of his keys on the kitchen counter. Rosalie would hear it too. It wasn't frightening. It was a comforting, heartbreaking echo of the life they had lost. Then, a month later, one of Daniel's closest friends, a man named Marcus, showed up at the door. He looked pale and shaken. He pressed a wad of cash into Rosalie's hand. $2,000. "This is from Daniel," he said, his voice trembling. He came to me in a dream. He told me he still owed me this money from a poker game. He said I had to give it to you for the baby." The baby came in the cold of January, a boy. And as Bala Blanc had predicted, he was the spitting image of his father. He had Daniel's dark, curly hair, his wide, curious eyes. We named him Daniel Jr., or DJ for short. He was a beautiful, healthy baby. But from the moment he was born, he was not a peaceful child. He cried constantly. It wasn't the normal, fussy crying of a newborn. It was a sound of profound, inconsolable grief, a deep guttural wail that seemed to come from a place of ancient sorrow. It went on for hours, day and night. It was a sound that frayed our nerves and broke our hearts. For 3 long years, our house was filled with the sound of his crying. It was as if he were mourning a loss he was too young to understand. It was as if he were crying for the father he would never know. And sometimes in the dead of night, when I would go into his room to try and comfort him, I would hear another sound mingled with his cries. A low, soft, shushing sound. The sound of a man trying to soothe his crying son. My carefully constructed world of logic had not just been cracked. It had been shattered into a million pieces. I started to remember the other prophecies, the other strange occurrences that I had dismissed as coincidence. I remembered Thayelzea telling my mother years ago that she would lose a great deal of money in the 9th month of 1990. She had laughed it off, only to be robbed of her entire savings by a con artist a few weeks later. I remembered him predicting the exact date of my maternal grandmother's death in 2001. I remembered how he had helped my cousin find her stolen motorcycle, telling her it would be returned in exactly 3 months and 10 days, a prediction that had come true to the very day. My skepticism had been a shield, a comfortable blanket of disbelief, but I could no longer deny the truth. We were not in control. Our lives were not our own. We were small, insignificant players in a much larger, older game, a game whose rules were written in the soil and whispered on the wind, and my family had broken one of its most sacred rules. The Hollow was a patient, unforgiving entity. It had taken its first harvest, and I was terrified of what it might come to collect next. The years that followed Daniel's death were a long, slow climb out of a deep, dark well of grief. Rosalie, my vibrant, life-loving sister, became a ghost of her former self, her days a monotonous cycle of caring for a baby who never stopped crying. The sound of DJ's wails became the soundtrack to our lives, a constant, heartbreaking reminder of our loss. We tried everything. Doctors found nothing wrong with him. He was a healthy, thriving baby, except for the sorrow that seemed to pour out of him without end. The old folks in the Hollow had their own theories. They said the boy was unsettled, that his father's spirit was too close, its grief mingling with his own. They brought us folk remedies, strange-smelling teas and poultices, charms to hang over his crib. Nothing worked. One day, I heard a story from a neighboring parish. A story about another family, another child who cried without reason. Desperate, I drove the 50 miles to their small, isolated farmhouse, hoping to find an answer, or at least a kindred spirit in misery. The woman who opened the door, a tired-looking woman named Marie, had the same haunted look in her eyes as Rosalie. She invited me in, and over a cup of strong chicory coffee, she told me her story. It was a chilling echo of our own. Her journey had also begun with a supernatural encounter. As a teenager, she and a friend had been riding their bikes home late at night when her friend had seen a ghost, the top half of a man's body floating by the side of the road. A young man had been killed in an accident on that same spot years earlier. Later, a fortune teller had told Marie that her marriage had been arranged by two of her female ancestors in the spirit world. On the very night her fiancé's family came to propose, his grandmother had died suddenly, forcing them to postpone the wedding. It was as if the spirit world was orchestrating her life, pulling the strings in ways she couldn't comprehend. When she finally did get married, she became pregnant almost immediately. And then came the dream. A dream so vivid, so real, that it had stayed with her ever since. She dreamt she saw a tiny baby no bigger than her wrist flying out of the smoke from her family's ancestral offerings, pleading with her to be allowed to be born again, to be her child. She had promised the dream baby that she would care for it. Her own child, a girl, was born healthy. But like DJ, she cried incessantly. A local healer told them the baby was spirit-touched, that the soul of the dream baby was struggling to adjust to the living world. They performed rituals, made offerings. The crying lessened, but it never truly stopped. The child, Marie told me, would sometimes laugh, but it wasn't the sound of a baby's laughter. It was the deep, throaty chuckle of a grown man. Listening to her story, a cold dread washed over me. It wasn't just grief that was tormenting my nephew. It was something more. The harvest the Hollow had taken had left a wound, a tear in the veil between our world and the next. Daniel's spirit, or some part of it, was still here, bound to his son by a love so strong it defied death itself. As DJ grew from a baby into a toddler, his strange connection to the unseen world became more apparent. He stopped crying so much, but he began to talk, and the things he said were terrifying. He would sit in the living room, babbling happily to an empty chair, a chair that had been Daniel's favorite. "Daddy's here," he would tell Rosalie, his small face serious. "He's sad." He started to see things, to know things he couldn't possibly know. One afternoon, a cousin of ours who had been battling cancer came to visit. He was in remission, feeling strong. But as he was leaving, DJ, who was only 2.5 at the time, pointed at him and said, with the simple, brutal honesty of a child, "You're going to see my daddy soon." The cousin passed away less than a month later. His cancer had returned, aggressive and untreatable. Another time, a childless couple, friends of the family, were visiting. They were talking about their hopes of adopting. DJ, playing with his toy trucks on the floor, looked up at them and said, "You won't have a baby. The lady in the white dress said no." The couple never succeeded in adopting. Their applications were mysteriously denied time and time again. His abilities were a source of both wonder and terror. We didn't know how to handle it. We didn't know who to turn to. The local priest told us to pray. The town doctor suggested therapy. But how do you explain to a therapist that your 3-year-old nephew is talking to the dead? Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. My cousin gave birth to a healthy baby girl. We went to visit her in the hospital. DJ, curious, toddled into the room. He stood by the bassinet staring at the newborn. When he came out of the room, something had changed. The strange, old soul look in his eyes was gone. He was just a little boy. He never spoke of his daddy in the empty chair again. He never predicted another death. It was as if the raw, powerful energy of new life had somehow severed his connection to the other side, like closing a door that had been left ajar. We were relieved, but also a little sad. It felt like we had lost Daniel all over again. Years passed. DJ grew into a bright, happy, and completely normal boy. He was a gifted student, a talented athlete. He had his father's smile, his father's easy charm, but he had no memory of the crying, no memory of the things he had seen. The past was a closed book to him. But it was not a closed book for me. The events of those years had changed me fundamentally. I no longer saw the world as a place of simple cause and effect. I saw it as a place of deep, interconnected mystery, a place where the veil between what we know and what we believe is gossamer thin. When DJ was 10 years old, I decided to go back to the swamp. I needed to see Thay Elzier one more time. I needed an answer. I needed to understand what had happened to my family. The old man was even more wizened than I remembered, his skin the color and texture of old leather. He seemed to have shrunk, to be slowly dissolving back into the swamp that surrounded him. He remembered me. He remembered Daniel. I sat with him in his strange, cluttered cabin, the air thick with the smell of herbs and old secrets, and I asked him why. Why Daniel? Why my family? He was silent for a long time, his eyes closed as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he began to speak, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "The hollow is not evil, child," he said. "It is just old. It has its own rhythm, its own laws. You call it the balance. We give it joy, we give it sorrow. We live, we die. It's a dance. But your family? You took too much joy at once. 2 weddings, 2 new beginnings. It was like trying to plant 2 crops in the same season without letting the soil rest. It depletes the land. It makes it hungry." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound, ancient sadness. "The harvest," he said. "It wasn't a punishment. It was a correction, a realignment. The hollow needed to restore its balance, and your Daniel, he was the price. His spirit was so bright, so full of life. It was the richest crop in the field." "And my nephew?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The things he saw, the things he knew." "The boy," Elzier said, nodding slowly. "He was the bridge. When a soul is taken so suddenly, so violently, sometimes it gets lost. It doesn't know how to cross over. It clings to what it loves. The boy was an anchor for his father's spirit. He was a doorway. Through his eyes, his father could still see the world he had lost. Through his voice, he could still speak. It is a sad and sometimes a terrible thing, but it is the way of the hollow." I left his cabin with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the peace of understanding, but the peace of acceptance. I would never fully comprehend the forces that had shaped my family's destiny, but I no longer fought against them. I had learned to respect them. I often walk by the bayou now, especially at dusk, when the light is soft and the world seems to hold its breath. DJ, a young man now, is usually with me, though he doesn't know the real reason I come here. I look at the dark, still water, at the cypress trees standing like ancient sentinels, and I feel it. The pulse of the hollow, the slow, deep breathing of the land. I know that the boundary between our world and the next, between what is seen and what is unseen, is not a wall. It is a veil of mist. And sometimes, if you are very quiet and if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the whispers from the other side. You can feel the memory of the land. And you understand that respecting the darkness is not an act of fear, it is an act of wisdom. It is how you survive in a world where the old gods are not dead, they are just sleeping.